As an enjoyer of single-player Bethesda games, Starfield was one of my most anticipated games this year. I've now put a little over 35 hours into it, and I have some thoughts. I'm going to keep it simple. The format, I'm just going to split this video into two categories, the stuff that I liked and the stuff that I didn't like. And also this video will include spoilers, so do keep that in mind. Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot of people say this. I'll say it as well. This is a Bethesda-ass Bethesda game, for better and for worse. I do want to come out right out of the gate and say this is not my favorite Bethesda game, and it has to do with some fundamental flaws in the design of this specific game that I think take away from the Bethesda open world magic, among other issues. I'll elaborate further, but before I get to that, here's what I did like about the game. I'd say Starfield's greatest strength is its side quests, be it faction quests or random situations you might stumble upon that quickly escalate into something unexpected. Bethesda's always been good at jam-packing their games with tons of things to do, overwhelmingly so at times, and Starfield is no different. And with Starfield's semi-futuristic sci-fi setting that deals with space-time phenomena, this game features some of the most creative and expansive ideas for quests I've seen from them. There is a pretty good selection of fun, interesting, and compelling premises for quests, and a handful of standout quest lines. It's abundantly clear that the quest designers had a lot of fun coming up with some of this stuff. If you're looking for a game where you pretty much always have something to do, always have some kind of narrative or quest thread to follow and discover, a game whose amount of content is so expansive you could lose yourself in the game and sci-fi setting for dozens to hundreds of hours to see everything it has to offer, then you've come to the right place. I also like the feel of gunplay in this game. It's by no means at the level of dedicated shooters, but I generally found that guns and weapons felt impactful and fun to use, both in run-and-gun and stealth situations. Third-person combat is still kind of wonky. I don't know how Bethesda hasn't fixed this after all this time, and the lack of shoulder switching during third-person gameplay still remains very frustrating. I don't know how this feature hasn't been included yet, but I do think this is the best that Bethesda games combat has felt. And the addition of boost packs adds a layer of verticality to navigation and combat that makes everything more fun and dynamic, especially in lower gravity planets. A pretty neat addition. I've also got to give a special shout out to the lockpicking mechanic in Starfield. I actually think this is among the best lockpicking minigames we've seen in any game. It's simple enough to understand, but can really rack your brain in the best ways at higher lock difficulties. Shipbuilding, once you get the hang of it, is also a really cool aspect of the game with just how insanely customizable ships are. One look at some of people's creations online and you can see just how flexible this shipbuilding system is. There's something really fulfilling about spending all this time crafting your own ship and then being able to see it docked in full scale and walk inside it exactly as constructed. Ships in general also feel pretty good to pilot, and I particularly love the ability to claim enemy ships, which are also full-fledged and fully built with the game's shipbuilding system, and you can claim them by either stealing them on the ground or by taking them down and boarding them in space. The visual aesthetics also deserve commendation, I'd say. I really do dig the NASA punk aesthetic of this universe's technology, and I did enjoy how varied and unique each major city looked in the game. Neon, in particular, really stood out to me with its gritty cyberpunk motif. There are definitely moments where the game's visuals can shine thanks to an upgraded engine featuring across-the-board graphical improvements compared to past games, with the lighting in particular doing work when it hits just right, especially on an ultra-widescreen monitor, which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, LG UltraGear, a fantastic ultra-wide monitor that I've been gaming on these past few weeks. This is the world's first 240Hz OLED gaming monitor with a 0.03 millisecond response time, making visuals look smooth, gameplay feel responsive, and colors pop. And with this OLED screen's self-lit pixels, colors look true to life, and the screen as a whole can get pretty bright to boot. Combine that with its 45-inch size, its wider 21:9 aspect ratio with a max resolution of 3440x1440, and its 800mm radius, and this monitor provides a pretty immersive gaming experience for your eyes to feast on. The screen's also anti-glare and low reflection, greatly enhancing visibility around nearby light sources. Playing Starfield on this monitor, among other games for that matter, was a pretty awesome visual experience, not only because of how big, bright, colorful, clear, and high-quality images could look, but also because the extra width paired with the curvature meant I could just see more of the worlds and galaxy around me, elevating some of those spectacular visual moments and making me more aware of my surroundings during combat, navigation, and exploration. And for the work that I do on YouTube, the extra screen real estate made video editing that much better. The monitor's exterior itself is also striking to look at with how thin it is, which also makes it easy to carry and set up. If you've been looking for a high-quality gaming monitor to enhance your visual and interactive experience beyond your more standard monitors, you should take a look at LG's UltraGear, and you can do so by using my link in the description box and comment section below. Music is also one area where I think Starfield really nails it. Inon Zur's compositions have always stood out to me across all Bethesda titles, and with Starfield, I think he really captured that sense of mystique of venturing into the vast unknown. So the bottom line as far as positives goes that if you like the Bethesda style of single-player experience, this game will in many ways feel like coming home. That sense of being able to get lost going almost anywhere and doing whatever you want whenever you want remains at the forefront of this Bethesda title, much like its predecessors. Unfortunately, I do think that Starfield specifically does often get in the way of itself and what it's trying to achieve, which brings me to the things that I didn't like about the game. My biggest complaint, by far, is the way navigation and exploration is structured, and those two things are a huge aspect of what makes a Bethesda game a Bethesda game. In past Bethesda titles, every major city, location, and point of interest was woven together by a handcrafted open world. Everything had a purpose for being there, and you could walk around and easily get distracted by all of the different enemies, characters, outposts, dungeons, scenes, and events you'd stumble upon along the way. But Starfield takes all of these elements and splits them up across the galaxy, across a bunch of planets. And unfortunately, this structure means that there's no longer something to tie it all together. There's now all of this empty space in between. Space is not a seamless part of the experience. Space and its planets are separated by fast travel menus and loading screens and mini cutscenes of the ship taking off and landing, putting giant seams between the game's various segments and making space feel like an isolated hub rather than a vast place of wonder and exploration, especially since there's hardly anything to discover by traversing through the emptiness of space. In Elder Scrolls or Fallout, because of their focus on density over volume, you would surely find something cool by just walking around in a direction between locations of interest without ever bringing up the map. In Starfield, taking off in a direction in space will rarely yield such a reward, so you're rarely encouraged to just pilot your ship and see what happens. It's ironic that Starfield's main selling point was space exploration, and yet it's actually the thing holding it back, in my opinion. There's simply too much volume between all the good content. Space isn't this carefully crafted tapestry that unifies all of that good content. It's actually a giant chasm that splits them. And when you do finally make landfall and explore the planets, there are even more loading screens to be found between cities and individual buildings and interior spaces. And so the game is constantly taking me out of this illusion that this is actually one giant connected galaxy. There's this parody video somebody made of what Cyberpunk 2077 would look like if it were Starfield, and it actually illustrates the Starfield experience pretty well. Separating content across such a vast space and across different isolated planets also means that devs could only do so much with the more handcrafted planets, which tend to only feature one major city that's just kind of plopped in the middle of an otherwise mostly empty landscape. Whereas in other Bethesda games, cities were always surrounded by landmarks, ruins, settlements, other cities, characters, and curated handcrafted content that would catch your eye, making everything feel connected and large in scope, and like there's just something out there to find always. With Starfield, we're not talking about multiple Bethesda-sized worlds situated on multiple planets. We're talking about one Bethesda-sized world diluted across multiple planets. For how vast Starfield tries to present a city like New Atlantis and the planet it resides on, without the connective tissue of a cohesive handcrafted open world, it all feels small once you walk around and get some perspective on how empty things outside the city are. You can't just walk outside New Atlantis and expect the kind of exploration that you found in past Bethesda games. The best way I can describe Starfield is that it's a lake's worth of content spread across an ocean, except that ocean is split into lakes across the galaxy. The game does try to mitigate this by sprinkling some points of interest here and there, some of which might play a part in a main or side quest, but when I stepped out of a major city, walked off the beaten path, and began exploring the rest of the planet, I rarely found myself rewarded with a cool discovery, made worse by how much more empty space there is on land. A few rock formations here and there, a few alien creatures to scan or kill, or some resources to mine were nowhere near compelling enough to mitigate the tedium of running through the large stretches of basically bland nothing in order to get from one point of interest to the next. It was just literally walking and walking. And with procedurally generated planets, the non-handcrafted ones, that's all exploration amounted to, a scattering of procedurally generated outposts, landmasses, structures, dungeons, alien creatures, and resources here and there that all began to look familiar after a while, all separated by vast stretches of mostly empty land. The procedurally generated stuff is never interesting enough to make the tedious trouble of reaching them worth it. The implementation of some kind of expedient land vehicle could have significantly mitigated this, so I'm actually really shocked that vehicles were not included in this game. It's among the most egregious omissions of this game, I think. And points of interest across planets aren't really discovered either, as the game will just kind of tell you where these are located on your map, so oftentimes it feels less about stumbling upon something cool and more about just following and checking off map markers that rarely yield really rewarding content. Sometimes you'll get some cool loot here and there, but I never found myself stumbling upon a discovery that made me want to do this kind of exploration more. Visually, not all cities are made equal. For every standout like Neon, there is New Atlantis that comes across more bland, sterile, stiff, unattractive in places, and very dead and artificial feeling. Performance seemed to suffer the most in New Atlantis. On my 3080 Ti, the frame rate would dip into the 50s in certain locales at high settings on a 3440 by 1440 ultra-wide resolution. Performance in general, I'd say, is all over the place in Starfield. It's never unplayable, but frame rate could wildly vary from location to location or from situation to situation. It's not the worst performing game I've played, but it certainly wasn't completely smooth sailing. There were definitely significant dips here and there. And while Starfield's aesthetic can be really cool, I'd say in terms of fidelity, Starfield's visuals can be a mixed bag. Some of the scenic views and aesthetic elements, again, can look pretty great, but there's plenty of blandness or ugliness to be found here and there as well. Now, all this would be easier to overlook and swallow if at least Starfield's main quest drew me in and took my attention away from these flaws. But man, did I find myself mostly bored by the main quest. It's just a series of fetch quests involving finding artifacts to activate New Game Plus. There is a cool twist involving the revelation that these artifacts allow one to travel to alternate universes, allowing one to become a Starborn and meet alternate universe versions of familiar characters, with that infinite loop becoming the game's compelling and unique take on New Game Plus. I do love the idea behind it, but with the main quest essentially being one giant fetch quest for MacGuffins, with almost every artifact acquisition playing out exactly the same. Fast travel to planet, get through a quick dungeon, collect artifact, watch the same mini cutscene, with the temples that grant you supernatural powers playing out exactly the same. Fast travel to planet, use scanner to find building, then play the same monotonous minigame involving floating to spherical distortions in the air and then watching the same mini cutscene, with only a few notable quests and set pieces to help vary things up, with a general lack of major stakes or sense of urgency, with none of the characters really having anything compelling to offer as part of the main quest storyline. The campaign to me felt for the most part like a drag to play through, which pains me to say. And while past Bethesda games' main campaigns weren't amazing, they were still entertaining enough, whereas with Starfield's campaign, I just genuinely struggled to enjoy it. If every artifact and temple featured more varied level design and memorable set pieces, unique puzzles to solve, high-stake quests surrounding them, amazing character moments to mull over, you name it, just anything to spice things up a bit more, I'd be all for it. But these moments are non-existent at worst and too few and far between at best. One or two standout main quests aside, most of the MacGuffin Collectathon felt very copy and pasted, and it doesn't help that rewards such as the powers acquired through temples feel underwhelming. The first power you get, the anti-gravity power, is easily the most useful of the bunch, at least of the ones that I've found so far. I rarely felt the incentive to use the others. These should feel like ultimate abilities that can change the tide of combat. They should be really fun to use, but again, aside from the anti-gravity power, none of the others really exuded that feeling for me. The main quest is further hampered by the dated presentation style of Bethesda games, which also applies to just all of the quests in this game. Starfield is often compared to Mass Effect, but Even Mass Effect 1 established its stakes from the get-go and relayed it all with a very cinematic approach featuring great cutscenes, compelling writing and dialogue, expressive characters, and more. In Starfield, there aren't really any cinematic cutscenes to accentuate some of the more pivotal or epic moments. Animations often feel rudimentary in a way that limits characters and scenes' expressiveness. Dialogue is presented in that awkward style where the camera just zooms in on faces that stiffly look dead ahead at the camera with an uncanny 1,000-yard stare, offering little in the way of nuanced body animations to make things feel more dynamic and alive. And the writing often felt sterile, awkward, and somewhat basic, often rushing through emotional repercussions, not flowing or fitting quite right, or flowing weirdly in a way where it felt like characters' emotions shift on a whim, all of which made characters sound somewhat unnatural. And maybe this is a symptom of having seen presentation of player-driven dialogue in open-world games come such a long way in games like Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Horizon Forbidden West, you name it. But when the bar has been raised so much over the years, it's difficult to not perceive Bethesda's style of presentation as dated now, hampered further by occasional issues like characters not looking in the right direction during dialogue, the camera awkwardly cutting to other characters who chime in or interrupt mid-dialogue and offering little sense of positional awareness, or pivotal moments that are meant to be emotional being ruined by glitches like these.
Sam, can you hear me? It's Sarah.
I actually love the way Skyrim presented dialogue more seamlessly. I wish they would have stuck with that style over returning to the more Oblivion-style face zoom-in. So these are some of the more overarching flaws that I had issues with, but on top of that are moment-to-moment issues that make the experience more frustrating. Menus across the board are cumbersome in Starfield, which sucks when the game demands players to spend so much time in those menus. The galaxy map in particular can feel unwieldy to navigate, further exacerbated by a lack of a list of major locations, meaning if you forget which system and planet a certain city is located in, you might be spending a lot of time just scouring to locate the city that you want to go to. Local maps are non-existent. For major cities, only icons and topography are shown with no details to help you navigate. There are no map markers or fast travel points to useful shops and services, especially frustrating in more expansive cities like New Atlantis, and interior spaces literally have no map whatsoever, which makes it easy for one to get lost or disoriented in some of the more labyrinthian interiors. Inventory management is a chore. I don't know how Bethesda hasn't figured out inventory at this point, but it's so basic and unintuitive that once your inventory starts filling up, it becomes difficult to find the things you may be searching for. It doesn't offer enough at-a-glance information, and all of this is made doubly frustrating by how much time I spent doing inventory management because of how easy it was to become over-encumbered with how much loot and resources the game enticed me to pick up. Tutorials for key features are completely absent. There's so much stuff in this game that I had to figure out through trial and error by looking it up. Little things like how to access the ship cargo, how to pay off crime bounties, or how your scanner shows arrows that guide you to your mission objective. And those arrows, by the way, did at times take me in the wrong direction, and there are times when the game will tell you that there is no direct path, at which point you're on your own, and with a lack of a local map, some of those interior spaces and dungeons can be insufferable to navigate due to how easy it is to lose track of entrances and exits, and how hard it can sometimes be to find the exact right door you have to enter through to go to the map marker outpost building I didn't even touch because the game doesn't ever really guide you through it or encourage you to build outposts for any compelling reason. And from what I've played and from what people have said, the benefits of outposts just don't seem to be worth the time investment. There are no tutorials for shipbuilding either to guide you through the basics, so much of my initial time with shipbuilding was spent just figuring it out. It was cool once I did figure it out, but getting to that point shouldn't have been that difficult. Ship combat, while it does look cool and feel good moment to moment, I would say it does overall lack mechanical depth, and there's no cool maneuvers you can do, nothing to really spice up the combat, and so it loses its luster over the long term in my opinion. Just feels kind of basic and shallow overall. It was also a mistake to not separate ship combat progression from character skills, as it further detracts from specializing in builds for boots-on-the-ground gameplay, and will likely result in a lot of people missing out on vital skills to significantly improve ship combat capabilities to even the odds against enemy ships, further exacerbated by, again, a lack of tutorials and player acclimation. And speaking of progression, I was not a fan of the way character progression works in this game. The way skills are categorized and unlocked are so all over the place that I often had to spend points on skills that I didn't need to unlock the skills that benefited my stealth build. Beyond that, some of the challenges that must be completed to rank up skills felt kind of silly. For example, there's a skill called gymnastics that offers new mobility options and helps you move better in certain situations. The way to rank the skill up is by taking fall damage, which is something that almost never happens to me naturally, especially with the introduction of boost packs. Another example is concealment, a pivotal skill for assassins that increases sneak damage. As someone who spec'd into a long-range stealth build, it was frustrating to see the game forcing me to engage with melee stealth attacks to rank the skill up, on top of the fact that to even unlock this skill, I had to put points into all of these other skills above it that weren't as useful to me, which I would have gladly skipped. I just wish that the pathways towards progressing towards certain builds just felt more natural, that things were categorized and sorted better, so that it never felt like I was throwing away points at skills just for the sake of unlocking the stuff that I actually did want and did find useful. Creating my stealth build was further hampered by my inability to take mods like suppressors, which are vital for stealth, off of weapons and attach them to others like you could in Fallout, paired with the fact that the game seldom offered suppressed weaponry as loot, and when it did, it was never for the weapon that I wanted. Others have reported getting suppressed weapons pretty consistently, so maybe I just got unlucky, but I've also seen other players experience my misfortunes as far as trying to find high-caliber suppressed weapons goes. And then when I decided I'd just gather resources and craft my own suppressors instead, I learned that doing so required putting points into a skill dedicated to crafting, which, to unlock, further involved putting points into skills that maybe I didn't want. 35 hours into the game and I still haven't found or been able to craft a suppressed high-caliber single-shot rifle to snipe enemies with. Speaking of enemies, enemy AI is all over the place in Starfield. During moment-to-moment combat, they are more often than not dumb as a brick, either behaving in tactically inefficient ways or just standing in place while getting shot. When it comes to stealth, there are times when it feels like they have eagle vision, and other times it feels like they're just straight up blind. Companion AI isn't any better. They often get in the way during combat, and when you're trying to engage stealthily, they will just kind of run into enemies and ruin your stealth plans, so I had very little incentive to bring companions along. They often were a detriment to combat. Enemy variety also left a lot to be desired. I just generally found that I was basically fighting just dudes in spacesuits with not a whole lot to distinguish them, with the occasional mechanized enemies or alien creatures here and there. And the alien creatures, none of them felt otherworldly enough or like a huge threat, save for like the big terramorph enemies, which you fight over and over again. Guards' reactions to your criminal actions can be all over the place, sometimes offering the option of surrender, other times just opening fire the second you're in their line of sight. More than once, I didn't even realize I had a bounty in my head because I didn't remember ever committing a crime intentionally. Every once in a while, I'd just like fast travel to a planet only to find that all the guards hate me, and so I'd have to fast travel to another star system and get rid of the bounty because you can't get rid of your bounty on the same star system that you have a bounty on. And then beyond the flawed elements are the myriad bugs that I encountered. None of them were game-breaking, but they were absolutely game-disrupting and immersion-breaking. Aside from the numerous crashes I experienced and funny but immersion-ruining moments like animation bugs or characters walking into dialogue scenes, there were numerous occasions where I had to reload or hard restart the game because of a bug where the screen would completely glitch out to the point where it was impossible to see anything, or because I would load into empty or glitched spaces and remain stuck there. One time, even reloading my save wouldn't fix the issue, so I literally had to like troubleshoot in-game by fast traveling to other systems and planets before the issue rectified itself. These sorts of major interruptions happened enough times and were disruptive enough to be frustrating. Overlapping dialogue was also a common problem where companion characters would start speaking extensive dialogue while other important dialogue was taking place.
You are one of the strangest creatures I've ever met.
I learned that back on Earth, people used to use the stars to navigate.
We have to.
That's so cool. But I guess it only worked because they just
Private
lived on
Sky
one
says
planet.
hi.
And that
No
sounds
more passing messages.
boring.
Decorum, Marines.
Remind me one of these
So,
days to tell you the tale of a certain
Come on,
solid
side off
code
on our unauthorized
and where
training
his
mission.
stargazing landed him.
Hadley lost.
And then there are smaller but still annoying issues like how my character would for some reason sprint diagonally in third person when I was only pressing forward on my keyboard, or how the stealth camo invisibility effect would also turn aim indicators invisible in first person, making it hard to aim, or how sometimes certain parts of my character would remain invisible while other parts would remain visible after deactivating my invisibility cloak. My Starfield experience was essentially death by 1,000 cuts, a few of those cuts being quite substantial, namely the way navigation and exploration works in this game. And the content that this game offered, particularly the main quest, were not enough to compensate for all of those flaws that made my brain just kind of tune out. There is a lot of cool content that has been crammed into this game, but with how the game gets in the way of itself with its design and technical flaws, the friction and tedium of accessing all of that cool content just became too much for me. Just having good content isn't enough. The connective tissue of that content also has to be compelling, at least for me, and when it's not, the game just loses its luster. 35 hours in, I realized I had no motivation to keep playing Starfield, and the only reason I forced myself to play as long as I did was just to do my due diligence as a reviewer. Now, some might say, hey, play 50 hours, 70 hours, 100 hours, and it'll eventually click that there's still so much I haven't seen, but even if that were true, if a game can't sink its hooks in me by the 35-hour mark, I just have to surrender to the likelihood that this experience just isn't for me. But that doesn't mean it may not be for you. I mean, I've seen plenty of people enjoy this game, as long as you understand what you're getting into and what flaws you might encounter. If you can get over some of the frictions that I couldn't, as many others have, then there is a whole Bethesda-ass universe here to explore and bask in. For my part, though, my take is that I think that the pieces for an amazing game are here, but the flawed way in which they're stitched together significantly holds back its full potential. And the culmination is that I just could not connect to Starfield in the way that I could with all of the previous Bethesda titles, and trust me, I really, really tried. But, hey, that's my personal experience, and I'd love to hear what you thought about Starfield in the comments below. Have you had similar experiences as me, or are you on the total opposite end of the spectrum where you really had a blast with this title? And let us know why. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.